Hi, everyone. This is Greg Brooks with Rocket Station.
You're listening to the Jess Get Hired Podcast.
You're listening to the Jess Get Hired Podcast. Make sure that you like the podcast and share it with all your friends. I can't wait to hear what you think.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Jess Get Hired Podcast. As we gear up for the summer, I have a lineup of guests who are ready to dish out the real deal on snagging that dream job or climbing that corporate ladder. If you're ready to make waves in your job search or you just want to stand out in a crowd, you have come to the right place. I'm your host, Jessica Fiesta George. You can consider me your new career BFF that's been helping companies and career professionals just like you for over the last 20 years. I'm thrilled because today I get to welcome back Andrea Misir on the show. She's not only a career coach, but she's also a marketing whiz who's graced us with her insights almost, I guess, 2 years ago. Isn't that right, Andrea?
Yeah, it's been a little bit.
It's
Good
been
to be
a little
back.
while. Yes, I am so excited to have you back on the show. On this episode, we're going to give everyone a sneak peek on what it's like to work at a startup environment, and I think you're the perfect guest to have this conversation going. Are you ready to have a fun conversation?
Oh, hell yeah. Let's just have fun and inform and help people.
Awesome. Well, before we dive into the nitty gritty, don't forget if you like shows like this or you like conversations like this, click that subscribe button. And then if you want to follow for more updates, follow me on all of the social media channels at Jess Get Hired, and then swing by jessgethired.com because I'm going to have information on how you can reach out to Andrea and other handy resources. All right, so we've got 15 to 20 minutes, Andrea. So we're going to tackle what we can about what it's like to work at a startup. So I guess let's just kick it off. And what is different from working at a startup versus a more traditional corporate gig?
So a startup is a baby corporate job. That's a short way of putting it. These founders have very lofty hopes and dreams to turn their little company into the next big thing. So one big difference off the bat that people will find working at a corporate job versus a startup is that there's going to be a lot less structure. You will be wearing multiple hats one way or another. Sometimes, I'm not going to lie, that's absolutely has happened in the corporate world where you'll end up doing a job that's completely outside of your initial job description. But with a startup, because they just don't have the same amount of resources or funding that a big established corporate company has, you would have to pitch in. So that's definitely the biggest differentiator.
You want to start in a work for a startup company, you got to wear multiple hats. And I think a lot of the misconception is that you come in, you get hired for a particular role, but then you get asked to do like 5 or 6 different other jobs that you're like, that wasn't really in my scope of work. So if you're not used to like stepping outside of your comfort zone, then you probably don't want to work at a startup, right?
I mean, I could use myself as an example. The last startup position I had, even though my title was campaign manager, I did product demos. I was basically helping current and potential clients just get a better understanding of the platform, which I was happy to do, but I don't know if I was like the most technically savvy person to do it, but I was nice with it.
Definitely. Well, if folks want to gear up for this fast-paced, unpredictable nature of a startup, what's the best way to kind of, do your research? Because there's usually, if it's a startup company, there's not going to be a history of things to look up on Google or anything like that. So is there any tips that you would give anyone to look into a particular company that they're interested in?
Absolutely. It's so important. This is for any company, but especially a startup, to make sure that you are as thorough as possible with knowing what you're getting into. So even if a startup hasn't been around for that long, they'll still have some kind of news story written about them, especially if they've received any kind of funding. Then they're so quick to publish that. Yay, we received $12 million in Series A or $30 million in Series B. That's a very good indicator. You want to make sure they have money so that they have money to pay you and to keep, the business afloat. The founders should absolutely have some kind of presence. I think every single startup CEO definitely has their own personal brand that they want to maintain and just put out there. Going back to what I was saying again, that they all have very lofty hopes and dreams. So absolutely, they're going to make a name for themselves. What are they posting on social media? Chances are they're going to have some kind of public persona that'll give you an indicator of not only who they are as a person, because you're most likely going to be working very closely with them, but also the
Right.
type of company that they are trying to build, which is more or less going to be an extension of themselves.
So I worked for a startup company a couple of years ago, and I would say right when they get the funding, all of that money is available and they are willing to spend it on pretty much anything, any ideas that you might have that make sense, any like people and resources and tools. But then the one thing I think with startups is they use all of that money in the front end. And then if they're not smart about it towards like the middle, or you can kind of tell when it's the end because then funding starts getting limited. So are there any surprises that people should be considering when it comes to like, the funding aspect and what I just mentioned?
Oh, 100%. And I'm very glad you did, because very important note for people to be aware of is that 90% of all startups fail within the first 5 years. And the number one reason why, 82% of the time, is because of lack of funds. So when interviewing, it is so, so important for you to, like, and this again, for any interview with any company, make sure you're asking questions, but you have every right to ask and find out how much runway do we really have, especially if you're in between rounds. If they just announced that a round of funding came in, so if they're Series A, what's the plan to allocate that money? Who's going to get hired? Obviously, like, especially like a lot of these startups have been popping up lately, have been in the B2B SaaS realm.
Right.
It's going to be expensive to find smart engineers that can build product, and it's going to be just as expensive to get the software and licenses and make sure those are up and running. So it's, if you are able to get, obviously, and it's very likely that you're going to get an entire balance sheet of where the money is going, but it would be great if they're able to be as honest as they can be and just give you an idea of where the money is going and what you would have to work with whatever job you'd be tasked to do, should you want to join the startup.
So what would you say, let's go with this, true or false? Startup companies pay a little bit more than traditional corporate jobs. True or false?
It depends. Again, just depends on the people and how much money they have. Of course, not every single startup is going to be getting as much money as they would like. If they do have the funds and they are committed to having the best of the best talent out there, they will absolutely try and poach some very, very high level talented folks. And that has definitely happened over the years. There have been quite a few people that have been working at the FANGs / MANGs of the world, Fortune 500 companies that would just end up going to startup for a change of pace, for a new direction and such. So, but yeah, so that guarantee, absolutely, when interviewing, just confirm with them what the budget that you have for this role, before you take a chance on, startup that could very well fail if they don't have anything in place. It's not worth your livelihood to go down with the ship that's sinking.
Well, going back to your comment about startups that fail, I think that's the one risk people should consider when it comes to working at a startup is, they're not going to be a startup forever, right?
Correct.
So if it is successful and you can get in from the ground up and make strides in the processes and in your role, then you can probably do very well. And sometimes startups will also give you either like equity or like a percentage once they potentially go public or if they sell to a private equity firm. So those are some of the things to kind of keep in mind, I think, when it comes to working for a startup company.
100%. But I do want to stress for anybody that's listening, do not be tempted by equity, especially in the beginning, If it's the later stages, like Series D or E, when they are very established, they have a wealth of rounds. And, well, actually, chances are, in the interview process, they most likely won't divulge how close they are to getting acquired or sold.
True.
But I'm sure they could give you a little bit of an idea. Like, yeah, there have been some conversations, but of course, that they're never going to say, oh, yeah, we're going to be going public in the next year. They'll have plans for it,
Right.
of course. I say that because when you are negotiating your salary, should you get to that offer stage, please, 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 please prioritize getting money. Get your salary first, and then down the line, figure out what the equity is going to be looking like.
True. Because equity is just a piece of paper to me unless you actually get to cash out. And I've been granted equity many times in different careers and never seen a dime.
Right.
It sounds
Equity.
great, but it never comes to fruition because either A, I quit before I leave the company, or it just doesn't get to that point where they're ready to even pay out the equity. So although it sounds good on paper, it's something to consider, I think, when you're negotiating it. Definitely get the top dollar that you can from the beginning, because it's harder to negotiate later.
Because until a company sells, exits in any way, equities might as well just be monopoly money.
So real quick, you mentioned the FANG companies. For people who are not familiar with what FANG stands for, can you explain what that is?
FANG is an acronym that stands for Facebook. What now people would just say Mang because Facebook changed their name to Meta. Right. Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google.
Right.
So the biggest tech companies in the world, basically.
Exactly. And they were startups at one time. Now look at where they are, and everyone's dying to work there. But, I think a lot of people, especially we're seeing in the job market today, a lot of people went to these larger tech companies because, they were paying top dollar for certain roles. But then we saw massive layoffs just in the last year or two that I always try to tell people, don't sleep on these smaller companies because, the bigger companies, you're just a cog in the wheel. You're just a number in the game. So if you can give these smaller companies a chance, you might have a better shot at being there in the long term.
Yeah. And I've said this, I've had this conversation more than once, I'm afraid, almost every day with people that I mentor and coach, is that job stability, the market right now is just not a thing, especially compared to where we were years ago. Even like around the Great Recession, I would argue that this market is just as bad, if not worse, than the Great Recession, because at least, the recession, we had an excuse. Business was bad all around. Now profits have never been higher, so we're trying to squeeze that out. I bring that up because a lot of times, especially like before how crazy the job market has become, people might not consider startups because they think like, oh, it's not stable, they're still small. There is a lot of risk involved. But there's a lot of risk with whatever job you can take because they can make the decision to keep you or terminate you at any given notice without even giving you notice. So.
True.
Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot of ground for the short amount of time we've been together. So for anyone who's considering a career switch, I think we've given them some food for thought. And I think that, it whets the palate a little bit for, what's to come. There's probably a ton of other questions, but do you have any final thoughts or any key takeaways that you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I hope we painted as complete of a picture as possible with startups. For as risky as they could be, they could also be a tremendous learning experience because you will learn a lot, you will do a lot. So they're going to be a great resume builder. Because startups are going to be so focused on culture. If you do find one that just meets all your criteria, both job-wise and even culture-wise, you vibe well with the team, they're great people that you get along with, then you should absolutely consider taking a job at a startup and just growing with them.
Andrea, I want to thank you for coming back to the Jess Get Hired podcast. So if you're aiming to land that dream job, climb the career ladder, if you want to hire the best talent, this podcast has you covered. I really don't think that we covered everything that we wanted to. So Andrea, will you come back so we can talk about where to find jobs and some of the interview questions that people should expect whenever they're interviewing for startups? Perfect.
Yeah,
all right. So we're going to have you back on the show. So stay tuned for part 2 of this episode. And if you want to catch this on YouTube or Spotify, you can watch the video there. Take the audio on the go with you on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you guys for tuning in. Remember, success is within your reach, so keep striving for greatness. I'm Jessica Fiesta George, your host of the Jess Get Hired podcast, and I'll catch you on my next episode.